So the name of this talk on the schedule is 5 Lessons from Raico's History of Political Thought, but I'm unilaterally renaming it to 5 Myths about the History of Political Thought, myths that Raico dispenses with. So let's talk a little bit about him and the book. So in 2004, the late historian Ralph Raico, a longtime senior fellow at the Mises Institute, presented a 10-hour lecture series here on the history of political thought. He called it History, the Struggle for Liberty, and attempted in a short period of time, 10 hours, to present his students with a concise summary of more than 400 years of political thought that underlies the political ideology of laissez-faire. So this lecture series is now available in book form. It looks like this. We have copies in the bookstore. It's extensively annotated, providing bibliographical notes and some additional commentary on Raico's sources and work. So I wanted to take that lecture series. So I took that lecture series and I edited it into a book and added all the sources and everything so you can look into in more detail for the details on this history of political thought. So it's an introductory work for the most part. It's meant to be read somewhat as a companion piece with Murray Rothbard's History of Economic Thought. And I think between these two books, you can come away getting a pretty good idea of the larger context of thinking and historical events around the ideology of laissez-faire. So should you read Raico's book, you'll find several recurring themes that come through in his narrative. And I'd like to talk about 5 of these for you today. Now, he talks specifically 5 common myths about this history of intellectual thought, specifically as it touches on the idea of laissez-faire, freedom, and free markets. And this is especially important, I think, coming from Raico himself, who was a working historian, had special knowledge in the field of intellectual history, and I think he's uniquely qualified to comment on a lot of these matters. So what are these 5 myths? The first is the idea that the ideology of laissez-faire, which we now call libertarianism, is separate from the movement that we have historically called liberalism or classical liberalism. Some people contend that these are 2 separate traditions. Raico shows that this is not the case. The second myth is the idea that Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in the context of the so-called Enlightenment, made important contributions to liberalism. Raico shows that the Enlightenment, by which is generally meant the French Enlightenment, and especially Rousseau, is not at all central to the development of liberalism or laissez-faire. If anything, it's very bad in terms of the damage done to that topic. The third myth is that we should look at John Stuart Mill as an essential or indispensable theorist of 19th century liberalism. In fact, Mill was, to use Raico's term, a disaster for liberalism. The fourth myth is that liberalism frowns upon the idea of class conflict and class exploitation. We're often told today that this idea is from the Marxists and everybody gets along in liberal ideas. Not so, Raico shows. And finally, the last myth is that constitutionalism will save us. For Raico, he thinks it's clear that the constitutionalist idea, which was a subfield really of liberalism, has clearly failed, and that we need to look to other solutions for protecting freedom and fighting state power. So let's look into these in some more detail. The first myth is that Raico addresses is the contention that libertarianism remains outside the historical liberal tradition. This idea is employed today by supporters of the status quo and regime apologists who they tend to posit so-called classical liberalism as eminently moderate and reasonable, while libertarianism is radical and a new invention that people from the 19th century would not have recognized. For example, if you see the phrase classical liberal in a bio of some political commentator, it's fairly safe bet that that person is using the phrase to communicate how moderate and reasonable he is. I mean, sure, he might want like slightly lower taxes or maybe more gay marriage or something like that, but he's certainly not a radical. And but Raico shows that radicalism is actually at the very center of the historical movement that we now call liberalism or classical liberalism, and this idea that it's pretty much just what conservatives like today is completely not the historical reality. Now, historically, its roots go back quite far, and this is one of the nice benefits of the book, is that he goes deep into the past, into late antiquity even, to really show what the true historical roots are of the idea of freedom. And in this, he draws heavily upon Lord Acton, who also did a lot of similar work on that. Now, Raico goes back to the levelers, really, to get kind of the first true political cohesive movement of libertarians. Now, they were one of the levelers, spelled with two L's, by the way, levelers with two L's. It'll come up as wrong in your spell check, but that's the way it's spelled. And they were one of the more notable radical groups. They were agitators of the English Civil War period. They heartily opposed, they were on the fringe. They opposed mercantilist monopolies. They were very much against any limits on freedom of speech. They wanted decentralization of arms, that is, they wanted private ownership of guns. They wanted local militias instead of military power controlled from the center. In fact, a lot of their ideas come down to the United States from the 17th century into the late 18th century, and a lot of their ideas show up later in the Bill of Rights. Now, some conservatives have claimed that the levelers were some sort of quasi-socialist group. They often try and compare them to the Duggars, who were much more truly a socialist group from that time period. But they weren't like that at all. They were a bourgeois, liberal group that would have been quite recognizable in the 19th century as a fairly radical, liberal group. Rothbard describes the levelers, for example, as the world's first self-consciously libertarian mass movement, unquote. Raico also points out that John Locke was influenced by the levelers' libertarian sensibilities, and Rothbard had pointed out that Locke himself and his patron, the Earl of Shaftesbury, were working out a, quote, neo-leveler synthesis, unquote. So Locke's radicalism is also underplayed by a lot of modern observers. Raico points out that Locke was actually very much dissatisfied with the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which Locke felt was far too tame and limited, would have liked to see much more movement in the direction of what we would see today as radical liberalism. And of course, Locke was very influential on Jefferson and on many of the American revolutionaries. Now, Raico doesn't have a whole lot to say about the Americans. His specialization is largely in European thinking and the West overall. But he does note, of course, that the Americans were secessionist radicals. They weren't like some sort of moderate group of people that Russell Kirk would get along with very well. They were far, far too radical for that, especially in their secessionism and in their devotion to natural law as essentially exempting them from civil law in many, many cases. And there was this radical strain of liberalism, Raico notes, that dominated in the very early United States, but has now been ignored by those who support the conservative authoritarian counter-revolution of the 1787 Constitution, people like Hamilton, Adams, and other centralizing federalists who wanted to do away with the more radical 1770s style revolutionary schemes of the liberals from that period. Overall, there's plenty of radicalism to go around in the liberal movement into the 19th and 20th centuries as well. For example, we can point out all sorts of radicals from both England and France in that period. I mean, it's clearly a radical liberal like Richard Cobden would be considered intolerable by most modern, quote-unquote, free market conservatives. Cobden led a group that was vehemently free trade, that was vehemently anti-imperial, that was anti-war. The liberals of his time period wanted to abolish the standing army. You had similar movements in France as well, with Charles Dunoyer, Frederick Bastiat wanting to get rid of the French army and replace it with privately owned arms and local militias. Herbert Spencer, of course, could be considered a anarchist at various times of his career. And of course, there was Gustave de Molinari, who wanted to privatize military institutions and essentially privatize all state services. And he also pushed for widespread secession and radical decentralization overall. Raico provides a lot of analysis and really shows how those thinkers influenced liberalism down into the late 19th and early 20th century, including within the United States. But of course, their influence now is today downplayed and ignored by a lot of modern day theorists who wish to really rewrite the history of liberalism. Now, also what you'll encounter when you're looking at this history of liberalism is this idea that people fixate on a lot of little philosophical strains, and they'll blame liberalism for all sorts of philosophical faults that really have very little to do with the actual liberal project in practice. And for example, Raico opposed this, by the way. He didn't want to complicate the matter of what was liberalism overall. So he says, now it is sometimes maintained that underlying liberalism is a particular philosophical system in the sense of a particular metaphysics and epistemology. There are simply too many divergent and conflicting philosophical traditions within the history of liberalism for this idea to be convincing. He just says simply, the working definition of liberalism that I will adopt is this. It is the ideology that holds that civil society, understood as the sum of the social order minus the state, by and large runs itself within the bounds of a principle of private property. This is liberalism as I will be discussing it here, unquote. Really at the core of this was opposition to state power. It wasn't some particular ideological or philosophical idea about metaphysics, especially in the way that it played out in the actual political sphere. The way it became applied in real life had very little to do with some of the philosophical arguments going on among people who might have called themselves liberals in many cases. Now, this concise definition of liberalism by Raico takes us to the next topic. It is the myth that liberalism's foundations are found somewhere within the French Enlightenment or even with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, if you've been through an undergraduate class in the history of political thought, you've possibly encountered the idea that Rousseau was some sort of proto-liberal. You might even hear this about, say, Thomas Hobbes, which is also an equally terrible idea. It may be that later theorists get confused by the fact that Rousseau wrote a book about the social contract, thinking this had something to do with with liberal constitutionalism. In any case, some theorists try to make Rousseau out to be a contributor to the liberal tradition. To say the least, Raico did not agree with this assessment. Indeed, it might be said that Raico loathed Rousseau, even said that we shouldn't, the ad hominem fallacy is something to be avoided, but in some cases, like in Rousseau's case, maybe we just need to discuss what a despicable, horrible person he was. So that gives you a sense of Raico's opinion of Rousseau. By the way, he included Woodrow Wilson in the list of people who are so horrible you should discuss their personal life. Raico goes on to describe Rousseau as one of the most destructive political theorists in history, partly because of his terrible ideas, but also partly because he was so influential. Rousseau was perhaps the single most influential theorist in the minds of the worst French radicals of the Revolution. Robespierre, for example, was a devoted disciple of Rousseau. It should not surprise us then that Rousseau was a great enemy of private property and a de facto supporter of the unlimited state. Raico puts it this way, quote, like Locke, Rousseau had posited an original social contract, but where the English philosopher had attempted to employ this notion as a foundation for civil rights, in Rousseau's conception, the contract involved the total surrender by the individual of his life, liberty, and possessions into the hands of the community, unquote. This community was governed by the so-called general will, which was essentially the democratic mass that would control everything. Rousseau seemed to naively believe that the general will could somehow be neutrally imposed on the population. This very idea is obviously absurd, but Rousseau had a rather unsophisticated understanding of the fact that the policies of a state must ultimately be carried out by a class of bureaucrats and technocrats acting as state agents. In practice, this unsurprisingly took the form of various French revolutionary dictatorships. One problem with Rousseau, according to Raico, is that Rousseau rejected the idea of natural law and thus respected no natural limitations on state power. Raico notes that Rousseau subscribed to a theory that society could be built and remade at will in accordance to the dreams and theories of a great lawgiver. Raico writes, quote, this is the puerile theory, the idea that a super genius somehow created a society, that Rousseau and other writers of the French Enlightenment had as to how society comes into existence. Society is instituted by some great lawgiver. Moses instituted the Hebrews, Solon instituted the Greeks, Lycurgus instituted the Spartan people, and so on. And we see here, of course, the seed of central planning and totalitarian dictatorships. Yet bizarrely, we often encounter claims that Rousseau was somehow part of the liberal project. Among these are F.A. Hayek, of all people. Raico notes that Hayek liked to denigrate the continental and French liberal tradition, but in doing so, he would include non-liberals in his lists of alleged continental liberals as a way to show how bad the non-British liberals were. So Raico says, there's a kind of funny game that Hayek plays, because in the British tradition, he lists not only David Hume, Smith, and Burke, but also Alexis de Tocqueville and Benjamin Constant, who were not exactly British subjects. And among the French, he mentions the physiocrats, the encyclopedists, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Henri de Saint-Simon. It's a peculiar thing, it seems to me, if you're talking about the liberal tradition, to bring in the French encyclopedists. Some people do consider them to be liberals, but Denis Diderot and Baron de Holbach and so on were hardly liberal, in my view. This is Raico talking. And then he says, certainly not Rousseau. So there's no doubt in his mind that Rousseau had nothing to do with the liberals. Unquote. Raico more than once expresses doubt that the Enlightenment had much to contribute to the liberal project at all, and the connection is indeed tenuous. For more on this, we could look to Raico's book called The Place of Religion in the Liberal Philosophy of Constant, Tocqueville, and Lord Acton. That's also downstairs in the bookstore. Raico approvingly quotes Lord Acton, who says, all these factions of opinion in pre-revolutionary France, that is among the French Enlightenment thinkers, were called liberal. Montesquieu because he was an intelligent Tory, Voltaire because he attacked the clergy, Turgot as a reformer, Rousseau as a Democrat, Diderot as a free thinker. The one thing in common to them all is the disregard for liberty. So today, a lot of these men are listed as liberals or proto-liberals, people central to the tradition, and neither Raico nor Acton are convinced by that at all. We can see other ways that Raico has aversions to Enlightenment schools of thought. One of Raico's favorite thinkers is Benjamin Constant. He notes that it was unfortunate that Constant had come of age under the tutelage of many French Enlightenment thinkers and then had to spend much of his, quote, intellectual career struggling to free himself from this mental framework, unquote. Being influenced by the French Enlightenment was a type of handicap if you wanted to actually think clearly. And also, just one aspect of it too was that so much of French Enlightenment thinking was essentially empty, in that it was just cynical and just regarded everything as not sacred, everything as being worthy of being torn down. What mattered most was to be thought to be clever in this social milieu of the time. And Raico says, Constant regarded this as disastrous to the moral life of France. So everything was just kind of a joke for the Enlightenment thinkers, and that really just did not contribute much to the liberal project as well. Now, so speaking of degraded moral life, this brings us to our next topic, which is the unfortunate influence of John Stuart Mill. Specifically, the third myth we will address here is this. John Stuart Mill was the quintessential 19th century liberal, central to liberalism as viewed in Europe and America. But this is not true. Many other theorists were far more important at the time in terms of real applied liberalism in the real world. But Mill's thought actually represents a distraction and a diversion from what has always been the most important aspects of the liberal program. Raico puts it this way. John Stuart Mill played a crucial role in the transition from the older liberalism, the laissez-faire liberalism, to the new liberalism. That is the modern left-wing ideology that some people now call liberalism, which is a type of democratic socialism. And Ralph notes that you've probably encountered this in your own schooling. He says, it is to my mind a disservice when a typical college course that deals with the history of political thought does this. As an example of 18th century liberalism, they'll maybe have Adam Smith. As an example of 19th century liberalism, they'll have John Stuart Mill. To my mind, he occupies a vastly inflated position in the conception of liberalism entertained by English-speaking people. Raico regarded the French liberals as far better thinkers and really even more important in terms of their influence, and we can see that partly in Jefferson, but also even some American thinkers later on in the 19th century. He blames somewhat Anglocentrism for that and the fact that Americans can't read any languages other than English, so they think that John Stuart Mill must be super important because he wrote in English. Now, Raico describes Mill's contribution to liberalism as disastrous. Specifically, Mill was bad when it counted the most. He was bad on trade. He says, quote, "The principle of individual liberty is not involved in the doctrine of free trade." And he wasn't even using this in international trade. In his context, free trade meant simply commerce in general, trading with your fellow countrymen, trading across national lines. Mill thought that trade and commerce somehow had nothing to do with liberalism and freedom. He then also was bad on foreign policy. He favored foreign interventionism. And in many ways that modern leftists do today, or just modern interventionists do today, where, well, if it's for a humanitarian cause or it's for spreading civilization and so on, the British Army can go and get involved in foreign wars. So he was bad on both peace and freedom, which most other liberals were quite good on during this time period, both in England and in France. So Mill was running contrary to that, to all of those strains of thought. Now, what contribution Mill did make, which was particularly problematic, was that Mill had this idea, he drastically redefined freedom to include freedom from private pressures and private discrimination. Raico writes, "Liberty, it seems, according to Mill, is a condition that is threatened not only by physical aggression on the part of the state or other institutions or individuals. Rather, society often poses even worse dangers to individual freedom. That is society, the non-state part of the polity. For example, Mill believes society threatens liberty with, quote, the tyranny of the prevailing opinion and feeling and the tendency to, quote, impose by other ways than civil penalties society's own ideas and practices as rules of conduct on those who dissent from them." So Mill had this idea that if you don't approve of other people's way of living, you're somehow coercing them. You're somehow forcing them to live in a certain way. And we can see how very modern that is and why people on the left would like to point you to Mill as the quintessential liberal because he fits very well with modern ideas here. But what gets lost in all that shuffle is the idea that state coercion is the true source of the problem, as a typical liberal would have thought in that time period. Now, as Raico points out, Mill was no fan of Christian morals and he especially hated Catholicism. And he attempted to make liberalism into an ideology that would reinforce Mill's personal animosities. Mill had what Raico calls lifestyle problems. That is, he was running around with a married woman, and this apparently took a toll on Mill personally. And so it seemed to really impel him to invent a whole political philosophy that criticized people who didn't approve of Mill's lifestyle. And so Raico says, when an individual has lifestyle problems, that's up to the individual, and it's a private matter. That's fine. However, when these problems fuel and provide the basic impetus behind one's political philosophy, then it becomes a problem. And so this obsession with getting other people to approve of him and this idea that his own weird version of sexual morality should therefore inform everybody in society, and everyone should get behind him on this. He came up with his own sort of puritanical reverse morality, which condemned anyone who chose to subscribe to his own view of culture, and which he condemned then as enemies of freedom. But this meant that Mill was, quote, in the words of Maurice Cowling, one of the most censorious of 19th century moralists. Mill constantly passed judgment on the habits, attitudes, preferences, and moral standards of great numbers of people of whom he knew nothing. So let us now return to better liberals who did more to draw out attention to the actual evils of the state, and this brings us to the fourth myth. That is that the idea of class warfare was invented by Marxists. Now, you will occasionally encounter this. I noticed that James Lindsay has some sort of obsession with this lately in social media, this idea that we don't subscribe to the idea that any group of people is exploiting any other group of people, and if you subscribe to that, you're some sort of socialist. Completely untrue. Raico has extensive work showing that liberal exploitation theory was actually stolen by the Marxists and turned into their own theory. And you can see this across many liberals, both in Europe and in the United States. Perhaps one of the most observant of this was Pareto, who, as economists, you're probably familiar with Pareto optimality and stuff, but Pareto is actually a very radical political theorist as well, and has some excellent analysis on elite theory and the ruling class and all of that. And he just notes in a variety of ways that, look, in society there are those who rule and those who are ruled. There are those who exploit and those who get exploited. And that this is a term that he uses to describe this is spoliation, spoliazione in Italian. And it's used in many cases by Pareto. It's used also by Frederick Bastiat. It's used in the French original of The Law, where he uses the phrase la spoliation légale, translated as legal plunder by many English language translators, but you can see he's using the spoliation term there. The idea is that the ruling class is engaging in this spoliation, that is this plundering of the people who actually pay for everything. And the Italian liberals especially were constantly excoriated the Italian state for essentially being a band of thieves and robbers that were constantly exploiting the regular people. And the great British radical liberal John Bright had similar views, and he also applied this very frequently and heavily to the idea of war. This was something that the liberals of the time period were very cognizant of, was that war provided the best excuse and the most convenient excuse for members of the ruling class to exploit the people who paid all the bills. And Bright certainly pointed this out, and he used the phrase the tax-eating classes versus the tax-paying classes. And you were either in one or the other, at least in a net sense, right? You might pay taxes, you might also receive some state benefits, but someone is net paying taxes and someone is net receiving taxes. And these are two different groups naturally at odds with each other, and this is exploitation that is going on. And it was the liberals that were very cognizant of it. Also, by the way, the liberals were not fooled by the idea of just because you called yourself a private organization, this did not necessarily make you part of the productive class. Especially in wartime, they recognized that private organizations were enriched very much by state action in terms of weapons manufacturing, in terms of a variety of regulations and laws that were passed, protectionism, all of that was used to help one class of people exploit another class of people. And of course, in America too, we have excellent thinkers along those lines. We had the great Northern Jacksonian William Leggett that Raico talks about and clearly likes. Leggett created the idea, the phrase of the separation of bank and state. And Leggett was a great enemy of the central bank and central banking. Also, William Graham Sumner, a great American libertarian, who also invented the words plutocrat and plutocracy. This was not to criticize wealthy people in general, but to criticize those wealthy people who used their political influence to enrich themselves at the cost of other people. So they were sophisticated in their thinking, and that it wasn't simply public versus private. You had to dig deeper into that to understand, okay, who's actually doing the exploitation, and these ostensible labels mean very, very little. The liberals were not fooled by this idea of the common good, that we all pay into something and we all benefit together. No, there are simply those who rule and those who are ruled. Now, lest you think that really the Marxists didn't notice all that, Raico goes out of his way to point out a couple of passages. He notes that the Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, begins this way. The history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, yield master and journeyman. In a word, oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another, unquote. That's how the Communist Manifesto begins. Raico notes that about 10 years earlier, a radical French liberal who was a protege of Jean-Baptiste Say named Adolphe Blanqui had written an intellectual history, and he talked about, and this is how he writes it in his book. In all the revolutions, there have always been but two parties opposing each other, that of the people who wish to live by their own labor, and that of those who would live by the labor of others. Patricians and plebeians, slaves and freemen, Guelphs and Ghibellines, red roses and white roses, etc., etc. For Raico, it was pretty obvious that Marx had just stolen this idea from Blanqui and the liberals in general. And now this brings us to the final myth. And this is the idea that we can somehow be saved by written constitutions and that there are legal solutions to our current problem. Raico is in many ways a pessimist on a lot of this. He felt that significant changes were going to have to be made to how liberals thought about things and what solutions were really out there. And he did not believe that there were legal solutions to the current problems that were really facing those who wanted to have some sort of a free society. Now, we recognize that the idea of constitutionalism is attached to liberalism. It's not core to the idea of liberalism, but it was a tactic that was generally endorsed by many liberals. Kind of the idea of voting also, right? Like widespread suffrage was also endorsed by a lot of liberals, but none of that was core to the idea of liberalism, which was the idea of limiting the state and maximizing freedom from state coercion, specifically. So Raico says, look, the constitutionalist idea, it was nice, but the problem was that the liberals supported this idea of tearing down all these intermediary institutions, of building up a unified, unitary state, and then thinking that constitutions could then be used to limit state power. That a mistake had been made when they did away with all of the old institutions, the church power, the guilds, the intermediary corporations, that had been a hassle, that had limited freedoms in many ways, but had also been a complicating factor for the state. That had all been wiped away by the liberals, and in place the liberals put these written constitutions. But it turns out those didn't act nearly as well in terms of limiting state power. So Raico concluded, well, the mistake has been made. All we've got now are these written constitutions, and lo and behold, who determines what's legal under these institutions? It's the state itself. And this, of course, is common in the United States as well, right? We have this written constitution, but it's the federal government that determines what powers the federal government may exercise. There's really no way out of that, he notes. So long as the ideology of the ruling class determines that whatever the state can do, whatever the state needs to do, the state is never going to let you leave. The state is never going to voluntarily threaten its own power in any significant way. Sure, they might let you win some little battles here and there, but they're never going to endorse anything that truly takes down state power. So, in the end, Raico sees the only way out of this as deconstructing the state and of embracing secession in a widespread way. And of course, secession is extra legal in terms of how it's actually exercised. In almost every case, the state is going to determine that secession, while it might be acceptable theoretically in many countries, they're going to fight it tooth and nail. And if the state has anything to say about it, they are going to determine that it is in fact not legal and that you have no recourse. This way, you're going to have to win some sort of battle. Now, Raico hopes it's peaceful, but you're going to have to be able in some way to change the ideology or the political realities within your country to get the people to embrace the deconstruction of that state. The liberal project made an error by constructing strong states and then putting in place these constitutions that Raico thinks failed. The answer is in deconstruction of the state. There cannot be any way forward that assumes states continue in their current form and continues to exercise power in the way that they are. So those liberals and conservatives who still cling to the idea that everything will be all right so long as we just respect the Constitution, so long as we respect those in power, that the right decisions will be made in some sort of conscientious way by people or those who are in power. Raico comes down very much more so on the side of a Pareto, or even maybe a Machiavelli, who sees that really the political game is the exercise of naked coercive power, and they don't care who gets crushed in the process. And so there's little hope to be had in what is the state-endorsed legal process, and we simply cannot rely on that to save freedom going forward into the future. So I recommend looking more into this book. We have copies down in the bookstore. Obviously, I'm just providing a very short summary here, and there's much more that you can explore. So Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.